Misconception number 41. Pre-ordering games is a somewhat new thing. Oh, God. Believe it or not, the first game available for pre-order was Pac-Man on the Atari 2600, seen as being a financial disaster despite its high sales, as Atari stupidly manufactured more cartridges than they could reasonably expect to sell, and in fact they made more than there were systems on the market. It was also a critical disaster as well, as it was a butchered version of the game. But hey, you could pre-order it. Misconception number 42. Halo is the most successful series of first-person shooter games. This one isn't even close. Halo games have to date sold around 42 million copies, recently surpassing the Battlefield series. Compare this to Tom Clancy, which has sold 55 million, and the biggest of them all, Call of Duty, which is at 100 million. Misconception number 43. X is the best-selling game on Y. Well, in a previous episode, I covered every misconception about the best-selling consoles in each generation. Now, I'll cover individual games on each console, at least the major ones. The best-selling Atari 2600 game was Pac-Man, believe it or not, which sold 7 million copies. The biggest ColecoVision game was Donkey Kong with 2 million sold, and on the Intellivision it was Las Vegas Poker 7 Blackjack at 2 million. The biggest NES game was Super Mario Bros. With over 40 million sold. For the Super NES it was Super Mario World with over 20 million sold. For the Nintendo 64 it was Super Mario 64 with over 11 million sold. On the GameCube, it was Super Smash Bros. Melee, with over 7 million sold. And of course the Wii has the highest selling game of all time, Wii Sports, with over 76 million sold. For the Game Boy, it was Tetris, with 35 million sold. On the Game Boy Color, it was Pokemon Gold and Silver versions, with 23 million sold. The Game Boy Advance had Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire versions, with 13 million sold. On the DS, it was New Super Mario Bros. With over 26 million sold. And so far on the 3DS, it's Super Mario 3D Land with over 5 million sold. On the Genesis, it was Sonic the Hedgehog with 15 million sold. On the Saturn, it was Virtua Fighter 2 with over 2 million sold. On the Dreamcast, it was Sonic Adventure 2 with over 2 million sold. PlayStation 1 had Gran Turismo, which sold over 10 million copies. PlayStation 2 had Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, over 17 million copies sold. And the PlayStation 3, so far, it's Gran Turismo 5 with over 7 million sold. On the PSP, it's Monster Hunter Portable 3rd, which has over 4 million copies. For Xbox, it's Halo 2, which sold 8 million copies, and on the 360, so far, it's Kinect Adventures, which sold 18 million so far. The best-selling PC game is The Sims, with 16 million sold, and the best-selling arcade game is Space Invaders, with over 360,000 machines out there. However, the most successful arcade game is Pac-Man, which has brought in $2.5 billion in quarters. That's a lot of frickin' power pellets. Misconception number 44. X was the last game released for Y. Now this is another one that I just want to cover a whole bunch at once. It's easy to find the first game released for a system, just look at the launch lineups. But it's a lot harder to pin down the last game released for a system, especially when stragglers will come out for years to come. And there are fan-made or other types of unlicensed games out there. For example, Battle Kid was an NES game that came out in 2010. But for the sake of sanity, I'm only going to cover officially licensed games for this. And I'm going with the latest game released in any region, whether it's North America, Japan, Europe, basically the last officially released game worldwide for each of these systems. Gremlins was the last Atari 5200 game in 1986. Klax was the last Atari 2600 game in 1992. 22 Iman Mezase Hotel U was the last TurboGrafx 16 game in 1994. Wario's Woods was the last NES game in 1995. Super Asteroids and Missile Command was the last Atari Lynx game in 1995. Virtua Fighter was the last 32X game in 1995. Shadowrun was the last Sega CD game in 1996. 3D Tetris was the last Virtual Boy game in 1996. The Lost World Jurassic Park was the last Game Gear game in 1997. Tekapaki Working Love was the last Turbo Duo game in 1997. Mickey's Ultimate Challenge was the last Master System game in 1998. Metal Slater Glory Director's Cut was the last Super NES game in 2000. Yikyu Gensokyukyu Perpetual Collection was the last Saturn game in 2000. Show du Millau Volume 2 was the last Genesis game in 2002. From TV animation One Piece, Moboroshi no Grand Line Bukenki was the last original Game Boy game in 2002. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 was the last Nintendo 64 game in 2002. Doraemon no Study Boy Kanji Yamakaki Master was the last Game Boy Color game in 2003. Samurai Showdown 5 Special was the last Neo Geo game in 2004. Yeti Sports World Tour was the last PlayStation game in 2005. Kurus was the last Dreamcast game in 2007. Madden NFL 2008 was the last GameCube game in 2007. Samurai Deeper Kyo was the last Game Boy Advance game in 2008. Madden NFL 09 was the last original Xbox game in 2008. And although they're still making PlayStation 2 games, the last scheduled game to come out will be Major League Baseball 2K12, which comes out later this year. Misconception number 45. Polygons are a relatively new thing. And when you think of the start of the use of polygons for creating 3D video games, it's easy to think of games for the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation 1. And if you think back a little further, the Super NES had a few polygon games such as Star Fox. But the use of polygons goes back a long way. Originally, the 3D effect was done with vector graphics, which is slightly similar, but features just the wireframe outlines of the shapes with no textures. The first game to use polygons in the modern sense was I, Robot, a little-known arcade game developed by Dave Thurer and published by Atari. A version of it also came out for the Atari 2600, though that swapped out the 3D and polygons for a 2D overhead view. Misconception number 46. Pit Fighter was the first game to use digitized graphics. Remember digitized graphics? Yeah, aren't you glad that's all behind us now? Pit Fighter is usually credited as being the ridiculous genesis of this ridiculous trend, but it actually goes back much further. As far back as 1983, when the band Journey lent their digital likenesses to an arcade game called Journey, where you controlled members of the band to escape from groupies in space to put on a concert. Yeah, they really made that. There was even a second Journey game, Journey Escape, where you had a concert afterwards avoiding obstacles such as fans and promoters. Yeah, a ridiculous game led to the ridiculous practice of digitizing sprites. At least we got some Mortal Kombat games out of the whole mess. Misconception number 47. E.T. on Atari was the first licensed game. I can't believe that people think this, but back in those days there were licensed games from everything from movies to TV shows to music to dog food. E.T. wasn't the first, and this questionable practice even predates the Atari console. The first licensed game was Fonz, an arcade game developed by Sega. Yes, Fonz as in Fonzie from Happy Days. They were off to a great start, huh? The funniest part is that with the hundreds of licensed games that would follow it, Fonz was a cheap effort, as Sega just took a pre-existing game, Motocross, and redressed it as Fonz. Misconception number 48. Castlevania II Simon's Quest was the first game to have multiple endings. Now, I saw this on a list of video game facts, and I can't help but debunk it enthusiastically. Simon's Quest gave you 3 different endings depending on how long it took you to complete the game, but it wasn't the first game to do this. Metroid, also on the NES, predated Simon's Quest by several years and also gave you several different endings depending on how quickly you beat the game. Most people only know that the ending reveals that Samus is a woman, but some of the endings in fact do not do this. If you take too long, Samus may actually turn away from the player in shame. In the endings that do reveal her gender, she may take off the helmet, the entire suit revealing a swimsuit, or even a bikini. Misconception number 49. Nintendo invented Rumble. Remember the Rumble Pack? You put it into your Nintendo 64 controller and it would cause the controller to rumble as the action dictated. It was annoying, but the technology improved, and now Rumble is a big part of games that we barely notice. But Nintendo wasn't the first to do this, actually. It was Sega. Remember when I mentioned Fonz, aka Motocross, the first ever licensed game? It was also the first game with force feedback, aka rumble, as the handlebars would vibrate if you crashed into something. Misconception number 50. Pitfall 2 Lost Caverns was the first video game to have in-game music. Now, I've heard this one quite a lot, and there's a glimmer of truth to it, but not much. Firstly, some clarification. Games have had music for a long time, but Pitfall 2 is attributed as being the first game to have music playing during gameplay, as opposed to only during the title or certain events such as cutscenes. It is possible that it was the first Atari 2600 game to feature in-game music. Of that, I'm not entirely sure, but I can tell you that by the time Pitfall 2 rolled around in 1984, in-game soundtracks were 4 years old. The first game to feature music during gameplay was Rally X, a top-down maze game involving cars. Like most pioneers in the gaming industry, Rally X is obscure. It was developed by Namco and published by Namco in Japan for arcades in 1980, and by Midway in America. It was never released for home console, though it would show up in a few Namco Museum collections, and in 2011 was released for Apple iOS. Well, that's it for Video Game Misconceptions. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. I hope you learned a few things. See you next week for the return of Clearing Confusion.